Some people only believe when they see it. But what happens when what you see looks like the end? The room was filled with machines, with silence, and with doctors shaking their heads. They said there was nothing more they could do, that it was time to prepare for the worst. But it was in that exact moment, at the end of medicine, that the miracle began. I know it sounds crazy. I mean, who still believes in miracles these days? Who dares to say out loud that God still does the impossible, even when science gives up? My name is Delilah Dunn. I'm 37 years old, an accountant here in Rockford, Illinois, and until that day, I thought my faith was strong. But nothing, absolutely nothing could have prepared me to watch my daughter be born between life and death and take a breath again simply because God said, "It's not over yet." This story isn't about me. It's about a God who still moves when no one else believes, when everyone has already given up, when the whole world goes silent. If you think you've seen it all, just wait until you hear what happened in that hospital. Because my daughter, she is living proof that God still works miracles. I always thought it was beautiful when people said they chose their child's name because of a promise. But Ethan and I, we didn't just want something that sounded pretty, you know? We wanted our daughter's name to be a declaration, a reflection of what kept us standing through it all. Faith. Not the kind of faith that shows up just on Sundays, but faith tested in the silence of long, sleepless nights. That's why we chose the name Faith. It wasn't a quick decision, it took time. We kept praying, asking, "Lord, what name truly represents everything we've walked through with you so far?" And little by little, that name started to take shape in our hearts, like hearing an old song and suddenly remembering the chorus. It felt like God was reminding us, "Your faith was not in vain, and what I promised I will fulfill." To us, faith wasn't just a name, it was a calling. I still remember the day I wrote faith down on paper for the first time. I looked at that word and cried, not out of sadness, but deep gratitude. Every letter seemed to carry the weight of years of waiting, the failed attempts, the negative tests, the tears I hid in the bathroom. The truth is, even before I got pregnant, she already existed in prayer. And that made it all the more special. I used to tell myself, when she's born, every time I say her name, I'll remember the God who never lies. And that gave me strength, because real faith does that. It walks ahead of the facts even when the facts say otherwise. What I didn't know was that her name would be tested in a way no mother ever dreams of. But that was just the beginning. The test was right there in my hand, shaking along with me. 2 lines. 2 lines after years of trying. I should have been jumping for joy, right? But the first thing I did was cry. A different kind of cry, one that mixed fear and gratitude. It was like my body was saying, "Finally," while my soul was quietly asking, "But is it really going to work this time?" The truth is, that news showed up like someone knocking at your door after disappearing for years. I had trained myself not to get my hopes up. When you wait and nothing happens, you learn how to protect yourself from disappointment. So I cried. Because even with the answer in my hands, my heart still needed healing. The fear of losing was real, and I wasn't pretending to be stronger than I was. It was Ethan who held me that day and said something I'll never forget. If God planted it, He'll water it. Simple, but so deep. I held on to that like a promise. With every ultrasound, every wave of nausea, every sleepless night, I would whisper to myself, "God planted this." And that helped me keep going, not untouched, but whole, even when my heart wavered. On the outside, I smiled, but on the inside, I was laying everything down in prayer. People congratulated me, but only God knew how much I still needed His hand to keep going. It wasn't just about carrying a life, It was about learning how to trust again. Yes, I was pregnant, but more than that, I was carrying a promise, and that required a kind of faith that goes far beyond emotion. From the very first exam, it was clear my pregnancy was going to be high risk. The doctor used medical terms, talked about blood pressure, family history, but all I could think was, God, this is when I'll need to trust you even more. Every appointment came with a mix of tension and hope, and for every uncertain report, I lifted up a steady prayer. It wasn't an easy pregnancy. I was on medication to keep things under control, getting checkups every 2 weeks, sleeping with a pillow between my legs and a Bible by my side. My faith became part of my routine, just like the vitamins and the ultrasounds. And you know what's interesting? The harder it got, the closer I felt to God. It was like He was teaching me how to live one day at a time. There were days I'd look in the mirror and say, "You're not weak, you're being trained." Because that's what a high-risk pregnancy teaches you. We're not in control. All we can do is walk, pray, and trust. And with every step, I kept thinking about the women in the Bible who also faced the impossible. Sarah, Hannah, Elizabeth. Their God was the same God walking with me. It was during that time that my prayers began to mature. I wasn't just praying, "Lord, give me a healthy baby." I started praying, "Lord, hold me up, no matter what happens." Because when faith grows, it even changes how we ask. I stopped praying for a life without problems and started praying for the presence of peace. And that changed everything about how I lived each day. There's something almost sacred about getting a baby's room ready. It's not just about picking pink colors or assembling the crib. It's a way of telling the world that you believe that dream is going to come true. Every detail in Faith's nursery was woven with prayer. The tiny clothes folded with care, the cloud-shaped rug, her name embroidered above the crib. Everything was a symbol of faith made visible. I remember spending hours in there alone, just sitting and looking around. Sometimes I wouldn't even pray. I'd just take a deep breath and whisper, "It's going to happen." That room felt like a personal altar, a sacred place where I laid down my fears and received peace in return, a rehearsal space for hope. Because even with the difficult diagnosis, I knew I had to act like someone who believed. And sometimes that's exactly what faith is, decorating before you even know if the baby's coming. We prayed as a family, with our hands on my belly, speaking life over her. Ethan would talk to Faith like she was already there, hearing every word. And honestly, I believed she was hearing it. Miss Margaret from church would visit us and always say, "Prepare everything like she's arriving tomorrow." That stuck with me, because preparing is a form of prophesying. It was during that season I realized something. Preparing your heart is even harder than preparing the room. I had to let go of control, of fear, of statistics. My greatest challenge was learning to trust, not in myself, not in medicine, but in God. And honestly, that's what strengthens your soul the most, when you get everything ready with no guarantees, just faith. The day had come. The bags were in the car, our hearts were tight, but filled with expectation. My water broke in the middle of the night, and we rushed to the hospital like we were about to meet the greatest gift of our lives. Everything seemed to be going as expected. Tests, monitoring, kind nurses, until the moment of delivery. That's when the silence, that sharp, heavy silence, took over the room. There was no crying, no sound at all, just the beeping of machines and Dr. Lisa's anxious expression. It's strange how seconds can feel like hours when your heart is hanging on to hope. Ethan held my hand tightly, but I could feel he was trying not to fall apart too. The room, which should have been filled with life, suddenly felt heavy, and my heart felt like it was sinking in my chest. I remember looking around, searching for a sign, a word, some kind of comfort, but everything was frozen. It felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. None of the moments I had imagined for that day included this kind of silence, and inside me, a cold feeling started to spread. It wasn't just fear. It felt like something had been taken before I even knew what it was. And in the middle of that vacuum, that emptiness of sound and emotion, something began to shift inside me. I can't explain it. It was like my spirit whispered, "It's not over." Even if my eyes couldn't see it, even if my ears couldn't hear it, there was something deep inside me that shouted louder than that silence. In that moment, all I had was the promise. And sometimes, a promise is everything.
In a matter of seconds, the room turned into a battlefield. Doctors were rushing, voices overlapping, machines beeping. Dr. Lisa was trying to revive Faith, her face more serious than I had ever seen. My body was lying there on the bed, but my soul? My soul was already on the floor. It felt like time had folded in on me, crushing me. Ethan was shouting my name, trying to keep me conscious, but he looked pale himself. I could see the panic in his eyes, like he was watching something precious slip through his fingers. Angela, my friend, was already out in the hospital hallway on her knees. And inside me, I kept repeating just one thing: God, don't let me bury a promise. That was the silent prayer rising from my heart. The room felt cold, but I could feel a strange heat rising in my chest, like pressure, like something invisible weighing down. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a physical fight, it was spiritual. Something in that room was trying to steal what God had promised me, and even though I had no strength left, I knew I couldn't let that happen. But how do you fight when everything around you is screaming defeat? That's when I understood. Sometimes the body breaks down, but the soul can still cry out. And it was that soul, broken and desperate, that began to stir inside me. It wasn't panic, it was a cry that hadn't made it to my lips yet, but was already preparing the ground for something even the doctors wouldn't be able to explain. And in that moment, something deep inside me started getting ready to fight back.
I never imagined a scream could come from the soul. It wasn't something rehearsed, and it wasn't a beautiful prayer. It was raw, torn, like my spirit had taken a deep breath and exploded in pain and faith all at once. God, please, do something. Those were the only words I could say, but I know all of heaven heard them. In that moment, everything around me faded. I couldn't hear the rushing footsteps, couldn't see the anxious faces. It felt like I had been pulled into another dimension where it was just me and God. A desert of pain and hope, with a cry echoing, "You said this child was a promise, so don't let her die." It was the most vulnerable moment of my life, and somehow also the strongest. I didn't know how to pray with fancy words or deep theology right then. All I could do was groan, and I realized something. God understands what doctors don't. He answers even the things we can't put into words. My scream wasn't pretty, but it was real. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. And sometimes, that hidden place in the soul, the place no one else can reach, that's where the miracle starts to grow. You know that moment when it feels like everything's over? That's where God begins. And I felt something shift. No visible answer yet, no sound of life, but something inside me lit up. I can't explain it. All I know is, after that scream, I wasn't the same anymore. And in that tense, heavy room, a small, almost invisible detail started to draw everyone's attention. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. A faint sound, like a sigh slipping out without meaning to. Dr. Lisa immediately turned and said something to the team, but I couldn't even make out the words. What I did see was the look on her face change. Something had happened. A small detail, but it turned the whole story around. Faith moved. Just a tiny shift, almost like an involuntary tremble. But it was enough to make the entire room pause. A nurse choked up in tears. Ethan put his hands on his head like he had just witnessed the impossible. And me, all I could say was, "Jesus, you are Lord." There was no explanation, only belief. The doctors didn't know whether to celebrate or keep trying to figure things out. But that breath, oh, that breath, was like wind blowing on the embers of a fire that was almost gone. Faith breathed. Yes, it was hard, but she breathed. And with that, something lit up in everyone in the room. The atmosphere of death was replaced by a holy silence, and then by hope. I felt God in that place, not as a concept, not just as symbolic comfort, but as a living presence, like someone who walks into a room and shifts the entire atmosphere. The battle wasn't over yet, but the scene had already changed. That breath was God saying, "I'm still here." And from that moment on, we weren't expecting loss anymore. We were expecting a miracle. Then the cry came. Not mine, hers. A sound that pierced the room like a trumpet in the middle of a funeral. Faith cried. And in that moment, no one could hold back the tears. Doctors, nurses, my husband, everyone was overwhelmed by a kind of emotion no science could explain. Dr. Lisa just shook her head, repeating, "This is impossible. It's impossible." But the impossible is God's favorite place to work. And right there, surrounded by charts and medical protocols, a miracle was recorded. Everything was documented. The time with no vital signs, the procedures, the test results, and now a steady heartbeat. Reflexes responding. No one could offer a logical explanation, but everyone witnessed what happened. The team even decided to record part of the process as clinical evidence. But for me, it was so much more than science. It was proof that prayer still moves heaven. Faith was alive. Exhausted, fragile, her skin pale, but alive. And the moment I held her in my arms for the first time, I understood. When God does something, He does it completely, and He does it to bring glory to His name. After that day, every person in that room had a new story to tell, and so did I. But mine didn't come with medical terms or heart rate charts. Mine came with tears, with gratitude, and with the unshakable truth that God still brings promises back to life. And there I was, holding my daughter in my arms, only thinking one thing. This was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, while Faith was still being monitored, Pastor Caleb arrived at the hospital. He walked into the room with steady eyes and a full heart. He didn't know the details yet, but when he looked at me, he said, "The miracle happened, didn't it?" I just cried. And then he added, "We were praying. The whole church was interceding at the exact moment of the delivery." That's when it hit me. While I was crying out alone in that room, there was an invisible network of faith holding everything together. Brothers and sisters on their knees, elders crying out, young people fasting. Those prayers, all of them, were covering our daughter like a spiritual mantle. The faith that carried us wasn't just mine and Ethan's, it was shared. It was the body of Christ moving as one. Pastor Caleb prayed with us right there, and as he prayed, I felt like every word was pushing life deeper into Faith's body. It wasn't emotion, it was authority. He declared that this little girl had a purpose and that hell couldn't stop it. And then, with tears in his eyes, he said, "Her name is prophetic. That wasn't an accident." And you know what? After that moment, my faith was never the same again. Because when you witness a miracle, you start praying differently. Not from fear, but with conviction. The faith that carried us through that hospital room was built over years of walking with God. But it was also the result of a church that refuses to stop praying. And the truth is, there was still more to come. Coming back home after everything seemed simple, but it wasn't. My body felt the exhaustion, but my soul felt it even more. The C-section scar burned, but there was another scar no one could see, the spiritual mark left by that valley. On the outside, I smiled with faith in my arms, but inside, I was still processing it all. Miracles are beautiful, but sometimes they leave scars that remind us of the battlefield. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw that line below my belly, and it spoke to me, not with words, but with meaning. It said, "You made it, you survived, and God carried you through." And instead of hiding it, I chose to see it as a memorial, like those stones the Israelites set up to remember what God had done. That scar became part of my worship. One day I asked God, why did it have to go all the way to the edge? And he answered me with silence, but it was a silence full of peace. I realized that some promises are shaped in the fire, and if he allowed the pain, it's because the glory would be even greater. The promise wasn't just faith, it was everything that would come through her, including the transformation inside of me. Margaret came to visit a few days later and said something I'll never forget. The miracle doesn't end with the baby's cry. It continues in the mugger who now sees God differently. And she was right, because from that day on, I never doubted again that God fulfills his promises, even if it's at the last second. And what was coming next was even more beautiful. When we returned to church for the first time with Faith in our arms, everyone stopped. Some people cried just from looking at her. Others lifted their hands and praised. And me, all I could say was, it was God. There was no other explanation. But how do you explain something that went beyond medicine? I tried to tell every detail to those who asked, but it always felt incomplete. Because it wasn't just what happened, it was how it happened. It wasn't just any miracle, it was a thread of hope held together by prayer. It was the impossible answering a cry for help. It was God showing that when he steps into a story, everything can change. Faith became a living testimony. Even now, people get emotional just watching that little girl run through the church hallways. Sometimes they ask me, "Are you sure it was a miracle?" And I just laugh and say, "You still have doubts?" Because there's no way to look at her and not see God's hand. It was supernatural, period. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore because what we lived was personal. It was intimate. God didn't just save my daughter, he saved my faith. And when someone tells me they don't believe in miracles, I just smile because I understand. I had my doubts too, but after what I saw, I don't just believe in miracles, I'm living proof they exist. As the months went by,
every little detail about Faith became even more special. The way she smiled at me, even as a tiny baby, carried something different. It was like heaven had left a sparkle in her eyes. Even the nurses would say, "This girl has a light." And I knew she wasn't just my daughter. She was a living promise. I remembered every word Pastor Caleb spoke, every prayer during the pregnancy, even the verses I clung to on the hardest days. One of them never left my mind. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I set you apart." Jeremiah 1, verse 5. Faith was called even before she was born. She was set apart for something much greater. It wasn't about what she had been through, but about what she carried inside. There was purpose. There was destiny. There was a mission. And that challenged me as a mother. I couldn't raise her with just earthly care. I needed to feed her spirit from the very beginning, because when God saves a life like this, it's because that life is meant to touch others. And over time, we started to see it. Children at church would come up to her and ask to pray with her. Adults would tear up just watching her worship with her little hands lifted high. My daughter had survived the impossible. But more than that, she had been marked to reveal the glory of God. And I had the mission to protect her and guide her.
I'll never forget that late afternoon. I was exhausted, overwhelmed by everything. Work, the house, and old worries that had come back to haunt me. I sat on the couch and cried quietly, thinking no one could see me. That's when I felt her tiny hands on my shoulder and heard the sweetest voice in the world say, "Mommy, can I pray for you?" My heart melted. She wasn't even 5 yet, but the words that came out of her mouth, they weren't hers. They were from the Spirit. "Jesus, help my mommy. Give her strength. Make her heart happy again." I cried even more, but this time it was out of gratitude, because God was using my daughter to take care of me. That prayer was a powerful reminder. The roles had shifted. The one who was saved was now being used to lift me up. The one who almost didn't make it was now strengthening me with faith. I realized this wasn't just a beautiful miracle story. It was a testimony that would keep growing in me and through her. And that changed the way I prayed from that day on. Right there on the living room floor, I understood that God hadn't just given me a daughter. He had given me an intercessor, a little prophetess. And if anyone still doubted what we had lived through, all they needed was to witness that moment. Because the same God who once opened heaven to heal was now living inside that gentle little voice that said, "Amen." After all this, tell me, do you still think faith is just a nice feeling? Do you still believe God has been silent about your life? Because I've been at rock bottom, staring straight at what looked like the end, and it was right there, in that exact place, that heaven came down and changed everything. Not because I was strong, but because I cried out, and God answered. Now the question is, what are you going to do with what you heard here today? Will you keep living like nothing happened, or will you choose to trust, even when the ground disappears beneath you? Maybe you're facing something that feels impossible, but what if that's exactly what God wants to use to show you who He really is? Are you still waiting for an answer? Or have you already stopped praying because you think it's no longer worth it? Let me tell you, the same God who brought my daughter back to life can bring promises back to life in your story too. But it starts with a choice, and that choice is yours. Now write this in the comments. What area of your life do you need to see God move in today?